To our regular viewers, if you were expecting to see part two of Boundaries from Colette, it is still coming. However, when we heard Kathie's story, all four of us agreed it had to be released first. So there's a part one to Kathie's story and a part two, and then we will continue with Boundaries part two. Welcome to Recovering Your Voice. My name's Bonnie.
I'm Caroline.
I'm Kathie.
And I'm Colette.
Today, we are really excited to hear a story that we don't often hear in this part of the world. Almost 50 years ago, our dear friend, Kathie, and her husband were believing in Christ's days and doing the hippie thing, backpacking around Europe. They ended up on a kibbutz in Israel. And when we heard the story recently, we thought, wow, we should have you share that story, Kathie, because it is so relevant now. Kathie?
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for inviting me to share this story. I was just saying it's caused me to go back in my journal, my humongous journal from our trip away, and reread 6 months of that year that we spent in Israel. We had no intentions of going to Israel at all. It was 1974. We were just married. And like Caroline said, a little bit of hippies. We decided rather than buy a house and settle down, we would backpack around Europe. And in those days, that was actually quite common and safe, as long as you had a big Canadian flag on your backpack. And we did. So we were traveling around Europe, and we got to Switzerland. And remember, this is 1974. And the Youth Hostel Association internationally was having a big conference at one of the hostels in Interlaken in Switzerland. And so they had no room for us, they said. So we were really discouraged about that and feeling very, oh dear, what do we do now? When someone came out and said to us, you know, they do have room for you. If you persist and if you hang around, they will let you stay overnight. And he was right. And they did. So we were able to stay there. And we were surrounded by people from all over the world who were there for an international youth hostel convention. And we got talking to a man whose name was Zwi Ben Yeshai. I can still remember that name. And he said, if you ever feel like you would like to come and volunteer at my kibbutz in northern Galilee in Israel, we would love to have you. And I think you would love it. And we thought, no, we really weren't planning to work or to stay anywhere for any length of time. We want to travel as much as we can. And we thought we had funds for a year because we were traveling on Arthur Fromm's Europe on $5 a day book. So you can imagine we were pinching our pennies for $5 a day to stay in Europe for a year. But we had budgeted, we thought quite carefully. Anyways, we kind of tucked that in the back of our minds, and we kept it, his address and contact information that he had given us. And a while later, when we were in Greece on the beautiful island of Crete, we realized, gee, this is costing us a little bit more than $5 a day I wonder if maybe we should consider it. So we did, and we quickly made our way back to Athens and made plans to travel to Tel Aviv. We contacted them and they said very graciously, yes, come, we would love to have you. And the bonus for us at the time was that we would make, I think it was about $25 for a month of volunteer work, but they would give us free cigarettes. And Doug and I were very serious smokers at the time, and we were finding a lot of money was going to cigarettes and food and shelter. And the kibbutz would provide us with all of that. But my husband had a very sick stomach. Food in Greece just did not agree with him. I loved it, but he was not doing very well. So before we could make our way to Israel, we had to get his tummy healed. And I remember being in Athens and thinking, we have to be somewhere where he has access to a washroom every hour or two until he gets better. And we were, of course, excuse me, we're expected to leave the hostel where we were staying during the day. So the best and closest washroom we could find was at a movie theater very close by, where the movie, I don't know if you remember it, but I think I remember every song from Jesus Christ Superstar in 1974. And I can still see it in the pictures on the screen in my mind. I can sing just about every song from that movie, because I think overall we probably watched it 5 times, because every time it would end and we would think about leaving, his stomach would get upset again. And they didn't come in and clear out the theater in between. So we spent probably the better part of 2 days there watching and listening to the beautiful music of Jesus Christ Superstar. Finally, when we were able to leave, we went to Tel Aviv. We landed there and went to the bus depot and immediately noticed so many soldiers and so many guns. And as we were waiting for our bus to get to the kibbutz, a young man came to us. He saw us studying our map, right? We didn't have Google or maps on our phones then. We had this big paper map, and we were trying to figure out where exactly our kibbutz was and what buses to take. And we finally had it figured out when this young man came to us and said very nicely in broken English, "Where are you going?" And we told him, and he immediately wrote a note and asked if we would deliver it to a certain person on our kibbutz and that we were going to. We said yes. And he walked away, and within 2 minutes, 2 armed soldiers approached us and asked us what had just happened. It was a little unnerving. We immediately gave them the note. They looked at each other, and one guy headed off in the direction of the young man who had just left, and the other fellow stood there with us for a long time until our bus came, and then he accompanied us onto our bus. That was unnerving to us because we had never experienced anything like that before, of course, but we were very young, 21 and 23, and very gullible. So we happily went on the bus on our way, but we couldn't help but notice a lot of armed soldiers on the bus all along the route. Our bus was stopped a number of times. Soldiers got on, wanted to see everyone's passport. When we arrived at the kibbutz, we were met immediately there by someone who took us to our room, and it was getting dark, and we noticed a lot of flares going off on the hillside. When we asked, "What are those?" they said, "We're building a ring road around the kibbutz. So we are using these and floodlights to be able to see so that we can construct this road around our kibbutz. We felt that was a reasonable answer, so we weren't concerned. We learned afterwards that just that very day, there had been a break in the security fences around the kibbutz, and they were actually looking for terrorists. But we were confused because they were calling it, in very broken English, just guerrillas, just guerrillas. So we weren't exactly sure what was going on, but we soon realized that our kibbutz was just within rifle shot distance of the Lebanese border. So we actually were in a very precarious situation, but you would never have known it. The people on the kibbutz were so incredibly grateful to have us. And being that close to the Lebanese border, they were desperate for volunteers. And they were so grateful to have us Canadians come. And over the next 6 months, we grew to love these people and love this country. And we made a number of trips into Lebanon. We were allowed to at that point. We were always very, very, very carefully checked before we were allowed to enter. And if we were walking or hiking, our backpacks and everything were very carefully checked. If we were in a vehicle, everything was taken out. But we found them to be very engaging as well, never cruel or harsh to us, though we were passing from Israel into Lebanon. And we worked with a number of Arab people on the kibbutz. Just to tell you a little bit about it, when we were there, they were having their 35th anniversary, and they were so prosperous. They were growing bananas that should not have grown there. They had a textile factory making beautiful textiles. They had turkey barns, and they recycled all the turkey poop, and they made it into cattle feed. And the Arabs would come, I believe many of them from Lebanon would come, and I think it was every 3 to 6 months, these humongous barns were cleaned out, and they took all the turkey poop, and we worked together to make cattle feed that we then could feed to the cattle. And I worked in the beginning in the orange groves, picking oranges. I don't know if you know that oranges have terrible thorns on the orange trees. And my arms, and you climb right into the orange tree. And very quickly, my arms were really scratched and infected and sore. So I was moved into the kitchen and the dining room. And my job every morning at 5 o'clock was to make hot porridge. And this porridge was put into huge containers to go out to the fields, because we would go out to the harvest and work in the bananas and the oranges and the grapefruit and the avocado fields. There were a number of times we had to get down out of the trees and lay face down, totally flat on the ground, while soldiers searched. Often we were brought back to the kibbutz until all the fields were searched, because in their regular morning routine, it included going through all the fields to make sure that it was safe for us to go. But there was no fear generated at all. It was peaceful, even in the midst of that. In the course of, I remember recording in the course of the first month, that happened 4 times, that we would be ready to go off to work to pick the fruit, or we were already out there. Often we would hear jets, aircraft first, and then always there was a soldier guarding us, would holler something, and we didn't understand exactly what it was. We just knew very quickly that it meant get out of the trees, get down, get face down, and put your hands over the back of your head. And basically we would hide in amongst the bags of oranges and different things that we had picked that were laying at the base of the trees. And the jets would go over, and usually, depending on what they were told over the radio, they were in regular communication by radios. We would either quickly get back to the kibbutz, or we would resume picking. And again, I just want to say to you that it wasn't ever panic. It was routine being on that kibbutz. This is what they lived with every day of their lives. And the kibbutzniks were so grateful that we were there, because I go over the course of a few months, got to the place where I knew the routine of the kitchen. I knew how to feed the children. You see, on the kibbutz, the children didn't live with their parents. They lived in children's houses that had bunkers underneath them. And every day, the parents would go to the children's houses and collect their children, and spend a few hours with them every day, and then take them back to sleep in the children's houses. And those children were looked after by incredible people. There were a group of grandparent age people that were child psychologists, teachers, caregivers, medical doctors. The children were so valued there. They were never unsupervised. They were always safe. They knew the routine, even the little ones. They slept above ground, but at the slightest danger, there was a whole system to go and to put the children into the bunkers and secure them. This might be a good time to talk to you about a situation that happened when Doug and I were there. And I think this is how we got talking about this, because we have friends whose young son signed up and moved to Israel to serve with Bridges for Peace in the fall. He is just 18, and as we are all aware, on October the 7th, Israel was attacked, and his poor mom, I could so relate to her heart, having my son serve in Afghanistan and be in harm's way. Suddenly, Denise found her 18-year-old son in harm's way. And I have a very good friend who served with Bridges for Peace and knew what it was like there and what Bridges for Peace would do to protect her son. And so I've been in fairly regular contact with her, assuring her and supporting her and her family through all of this. But he has determined to stay and to trust that he is where he is supposed to be at this time. And our situation was different in that we were living on the kibbutz. We had been for some months already. We had become very familiar with kibbutz life. And in 1974 and 75, Henry Kissinger was arbitrating peace talks between Israel and the surrounding countries, specifically with Lebanon at that time. And it looked like there was going to be war. And talk about being on the front lines. Like I said, we were scolded for riding our horses around the ring road of the kibbutz because we were within rifle shot of Lebanon. We didn't realize how close we were. But because we were that close, it was pretty much guaranteed that our kibbutz and the two adjoining us would come under major fire if war broke out. But we did not know that. When we went to bed the night before, we did not know that peace talks were falling apart. The next morning, our entire kibbutz was transformed into an army base that fast. The kibbutzniks are amazing, and the Israeli people are amazing. Our kids that we had picked oranges with and fried eggs with and made porridge with and schlepped bananas with and cleaned turkey poop with were suddenly in full army gear with armed weapons. And unbeknownst to us, there was a whole radio base underneath our dining room. And I had worked in the kitchen and the dining room complex for months, and I had seen many soldiers. It was not uncommon for us to go and have dinner and be moving machine guns out of the way in order to sit down. And I did not even know. And I was there often from, like I said, 5 o'clock in the morning, first one there, had no idea what was located right underneath my feet. And suddenly these kids who are conscripted, right? Mandatory conscription when they're 18, they go for military training, and they were willing to lay down their lives to fight for their country. And it so moved Doug and I that we were given the option to leave, but we stayed because I could make sure everybody was going, everybody was leaving, and there were turkeys and there were cattle and there were, the banana harvest had just finished. But there's a cattle herd there that needs to be moved because pasture land is very sparse in Israel. And we both knew how to ride and how to herd cattle to move them. And I knew how to operate the kitchen. And we would make sure that the children and the seniors and anyone who was incapacitated was moved into the children's houses and into the bunkers. And we had kitchens set up down there for them. And we felt that we needed to stay and look after those who would not be going. And do you know that it all got resolved, but there was not a shadow of doubt in our hearts and in our minds that we needed to stay and help these people that were so devoted to each other and to their country and to their families and to Israel. Like, oh my goodness, it's just, so we stayed. Thank God it was resolved. My husband emailed our kibbutz recently, and some of the people that we worked with are still there and remembered us. And 49 years later, thanked us for staying and helping them through that difficult time. I thought about all the different beautiful places that we were privileged to travel to in Israel when we were there. And we see the pictures on the news, and we see the people struggling so terribly, and the children, and especially. And I think of all those precious kids that we were able to be there for during that season, and the young moms and the elderly and the sick and the disabled. And we were able to do just such a small part to keep everyone safe and fed and looked after during that season. Reading this journal again and seeing the resilience and the beauty and the history and the hearts of those people, and seeing the people from Israel, from our kibbutz, and the people from Lebanon, and the Arab people all working together during that time was so beautiful. And my heart longs for that to be manifested somehow there in the midst of all that tragedy. And I see in rereading my journal God's goodness to us who did not know him or acknowledge him, and used his name in vain and over again as I read this journal. And yet I see the fingerprints of God on our lives even there. And my heart's cry is, God, hold those beautiful people on all sides, in Israel, in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip. I mean, we're talking war, right? Full out war here. Doug and I tasted just a little bit of the tragedy of it. My heart just aches for the people there. But I saw God manifest in our lives so many times, protecting us in our stay there. And I just pray, God, they need your protection, your mercy, your grace, your resolution to this. Just as God was pursuing us when we were there, who did not acknowledge him as Savior and Lord, open the eyes, meet them, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. Meet all of these different ones and hold them in the palm of your hands, and visit them with dreams and visions and people who will speak truth. As you know, sadly, Doug and I are not together anymore, but we still get together and are good friends with all of our children and our grandkids, and we celebrate birthdays and every holiday. And we have a May family chat that we're all part of, and we, stay up to date and talk all the time, and are very good friends. And our last big family birthday was October the 23rd. And we were all together, and we were sitting at the table having dinner together, and kids spread out everywhere, and lots of laughter. And as you know, my boys, the May men have big voices, right? So I'm sort of hollering across the table to Doug, who is hearing impaired, and just wanting to talk about Israel so badly and what was going on there, but not really wanting to bring it up because it's so tragic and so terribly sad. And then suddenly he looked at me and he said, so I sent an email to the kibbutz, and my heart just leaped within me that we're still on the same page with our hearts for Israel 49 years later. Literally, like I wrote down some dates. It was October 1974. October 1974, 49 years ago, that we arrived at the kibbutz. And Doug said, I sent the email on October the 7th to say that we were praying for them. And I got an answer back almost right away from the cattle boss, who is now the head director of the kibbutz, and he remembers us. And he shared our email with Nisim, who worked hand in hand with Doug and was actually bodyguard to Golda Meir, had just returned to the kibbutz after being bodyguard to Golda Meir, who was the prime minister of Israel right at the time. And they're still there, babe, and they still remember us, and they thanked us for having come and volunteered when so many people, as soon as found out where the kibbutz were, reneged on their offer to come and volunteer there. So that really touched my heart that we still have that in common, you know, that our spirits and our hearts are still joined with our kibbutz family back home. Back home, I said, didn't I? I didn't even realize it. But those 6 months made such an impact on our lives. And rereading this journal, yes, it's this big hardcover, weighs about 5 pounds, traveled in our backpacks all over Europe and all the way home. And I had to use the magnifying glass on my phone to read most of it because the writing is so tiny, because our days were so full and we experienced so much love, so much resilience, so much peace. It really grabs my heart when I think about it. And when we were gathered with our children and there was so much joy, and we as a family living in such peace and, you know, being together, and so blessed to live here, that when Doug told me this, it was like this. I said, I can't even remember what I said. I said, oh my goodness, we need to share this with our children, because this is their inheritance too, right? Because we as their mom and dad were there, and what we experienced and we pass on to our children becomes part of their legacy, right? And so I said, kids, you need to hear what Dad just shared with me. And he broke down. His heart was so touched by receiving their answer back and their gratitude. It just went like, I mean, and when my kids are together, well, you've been with them, you know, it's like, I wish I could do that big whistle, you know, to get their attention, but it was perfectly quiet for a few minutes while their dad shared with them. It was really, really precious.
That's an incredible story. Just an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. You've given us a little glimpse into a tiny glimpse into what life might be like there.
We were wrecked. Our hearts were still back on the kibbutz. I'm not saying its name for reasons. I'm not talking about the area because you have to be so careful, right? And even in my journal, I noticed that we were writing by code, perchance our journals were ever found, right? So you always had to be very, very careful, but you just were. You just did it, you know? And we were wrecked. We went back to Europe. There were still some countries that we hadn't visited before we had come to Israel. And we did do them, but reading afterwards, it's like our hearts were still back in Israel. I think if our families back home had been at peace with it, we probably would have gone back and quite possibly stayed, because it was just like, when you look at a map and you look at Israel and you look at all what are considered their enemy states, I suppose. I don't like to use that term because then it becomes us and them. But Israel is surrounded by, I suppose, the media, I think, calls them enemy states. And yet there's just this tiny little country that it's 1948, right? Yeah. Since 1948, with just these very few people, when you think about it. And even in the midst of that, there's the Gaza Strip, right? But when I think about that, wow, God's hand has to be on those people, on his precious people there. And I feel so honored to have been there and been part of that. Yeah. It's obviously really impacted my life still 49 years later.
Thank you so much, Kathie, for sharing that very affecting story today and giving all of us some perspective on life there in Israel. And it sounds like it's still going on in much the same way as when you and Doug worked there. Thank you, Kathie.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you've been impacted as we have by this story, and you want to hear more stories about this, that's what Recovering Your Voice is all about. That we learn about each other. We learn that we're more the same than we're different by hearing the stories. So thank you, Kathie, for sharing this story. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And if you want to write us, we're at recoveringyourvoice@gmail.com. But as always, keep sharing your story.
So I am looking for my elastic. I noticed that my thing keeps going down, my glasses, and I keep doing this. So I made this to go on my glasses. You can't see, but I'm not doing this.
Well, it's
Well,
great.
you'll need to do one of those for me.
I
And for
will.
me.
If you guys want, I can make you them. You want one?
Oh, yeah.
Seriously. Yeah. Okay.
It's funny the things that you notice afterwards.
Mhm.
Like I looked part of the time like I had a birdhouse on my head, and then and then another time I think the sunlight hit my glasses and blinded everybody. So I'm over here in the dark again. You girls are so good for me. Laughter is such a good medicine, right?
I always
It is.
notice how many I put in, or likes, or as I'm editing, I hear, oh, not another one. Oh my gosh, how many times do I have to say that, Bonnie?
Right?
Yeah. Right. Okay.
My students used to say, we like it when you teach us English, Miss May, because you make it like a song. You go up and down and up and down. It's like a song. So maybe that's good, right? Right?
Hey, go where no man has gone before. Come to Gabriel.